Hello, you wonderful people, and welcome to another episode of Super-Fanta-Fi. This being a show where I talk about TV shows of the supernatural, fantasy, and/or science fictional genre. For today's episode, I'm going to talk about the latest episode of Charmed. A lot of really interesting things went down in this episode, so let's break it down. I really like the fact that we start in the middle of things. Obviously, Maggie's trying to clear her mind, thinking about the whole her and Antonio thing. And obviously she kind of snaps to it, being no, because he comes out just in a towel, oh, hey, Magster. And it's just no. And she's kind of alone in the house. At first, I'm is she astral projecting or something? At first, I was wondering if, does she was it going to be a thing of, she ends up getting stuck on the astral plane? But it's nope. There's a lot more at play here, because then we start slowly finding out, oh, you have Macy and then Mel in the same situation. They're all scattered in, this maze-like place. And it's every time they open the door, it doesn't work the way it should. They just kind of end up going to a different spot that's connected to them. Then you have Mel and Macy finding each other. But I also like how things are a little out of order too, because when Macy came across the bloody towel, she's oh my god, what happened? And it turns out it was Mel from punching the window to break into the house. But then it's she's already has it around her hand, so it's oh, kind of showing you the inconsistencies in the world. But obviously her and Mel run into each other, and Mel's hey, Macy, and she tries to get to Macy, but ends up going through another portal. Damn it, I'll work this out. Manages to get back. But I also love that it's they're beefing immediately, because it's oh, where'd the blood come from? It's yeah, I tried to punch, I couldn't get in, so I just broke the window. It's oh, that was kind of aggressive of you. It's this is the time to kind of be calm and collect data, is essentially. So they're kind of already butting heads on the approaches to everything, because she's been recording notes the entire time on her phone, which I love. Ironically, later on she's playing her notes back, and it turns into a kind of a bop. And she's come on, that's not fair. And then she kind of after a while starts digging it. I think the whole point was to kind of play into the whole distracting her, because just when she's kind of at a low point of oh damn, it's the tune kind of catches her and she's kind of getting lost in it a little bit. It's almost like a siren's call, I think, in a sense. But regardless, getting back to present day, they're trying to navigate their way around this place because it's a literal maze. And then they run into Maggie, except Maggie doesn't remember who they are, because she's whoa, you're real, oh my god, but who are you? Because apparently she's been there for 42 days, and the longer you're there, the more your memory gets a little hazy, which this whole thing is interesting in many different regards. It kind of reminds me of Winona Earp, just because the fog that's happening right now in the Ghost River Triangle that's kind of bleeding in from the garden. There's that, but it also reminds me of Hell from Preacher, once again, specifically to show, because I don't know if Hell works the same way in the graphic novel. But basically, it's your hell. It's kind of hell is of your own making, and it's the prison doesn't exactly work like that. But I like finding out oh, they're actually inside the prison. They actually found a way into the monster prison, and this is basically it's manifesting this way. It's trying to keep them confused and lost. So that's the perfect sell, by making it seem like you're in a familiar place, but then you get lost the further and harder you try to get out. So I thought that was kind of really interesting. Then there's the tick, tick, boom. And it's Maggie was prepared for it because she put on the shades and covered her area. It's oh, you get, and it's I even love the Mel being oh, it's oh, Maggie not only forgotten stuff, she's just crazy. So if we stay here too long, you get crazy Maggie. But slowly but surely, her memories start coming back when it's oh, you're Mel. Mel, she's yeah, that sounds familiar. Macy, I know your name. And it's her lunch bag, and that leads to a memory, which of Jordan and Maggie and Macy, because Macy tried to get that free clinic started, but the board said no, and Jordan was kind of coming on board to help, to kind of, because his the firm he's interning at let him say oh, he can get in some hours here. But obviously it kind of fell through because it wasn't financially sound, so they kind of had to back down. But that memory, it faded. But also it got it wrong, because on Macy's, when Maggie was initially looking at it, it said Macy Vera, but obviously her last name is Vaughn. It makes me wonder, would she ever decide to change her last name to Vera? But it's probably the point of like, regardless of her last name, she's a Vera sister through and through, so it doesn't matter. They're sisters, so like her last name shouldn't matter. So I just thought about that. I thought it was like, because it's come up before, like, oh yeah, she's still Macy Vaughn and not Macy Vera, but obviously that plays a role in this episode by being like, oh, that was something that was wrong, and remembering that and catching what they later on start referring to as a glitch. Gave them the idea of like, oh, they know how to like fight back. Like eventually they ended up figuring out that there are glitches everywhere, and they, by seeing through the glitches, they're able to kind of break the prison's spell on them to a certain extent. And obviously as they're trying to figure things out, the prison is constantly adapting. The perfect prison, in fact, it kind of separates them because it's like, whoa, you guys are figuring too much out together. Separate corners. Macy's trying to go up the stairs. Kid's teleported back down. She's stuck in command center. Maggie finds a photo of her and Antonio, and then she's like, no, I'm not gonna. She's fighting it like, oh, I'm not. This isn't like, if we ever did get together, there wouldn't be any photograph proof of it. But then it was like, wait, this never happened between us, so it's another thing. So she thinks back to the memory of Antonio being like, oh, I want to go for a latte. She's obviously avoiding him. The whole pink elephant thing. It's kind of, there's a specific terminology for it, but I always think of Inception. Oh, and I guess that's the specific reference to it. They never really said pink elephant, they just said elephant. Now, if I tell you if I told you not to think about elephant, what's the first thing you think about? Elephants. Like, obviously, I'll always trace that back to Inception. Obviously, it's probably like, it's definitely like a mental thing anyway that Inception was pulling from, but like, that will always be my pop culture reference to that. But I also like what Macy was saying, the whole line of, when you focus on your fears, you end up running into them. When you focus on your goals, you manifest them. So I thought that was kind of a nice, thing. And obviously that plays a role in later on when they're kind of figuring things out. But Maggie was luckily able to find Macy and was able to kind of pull her back by being like, it's me, I'm Maggie, I'm your sister. So I actually think, considering how they talk about it later on, how this place worked, that this place doesn't understand context, it confuses hate and love because it doesn't understand emotions. I'm like, that actually is interesting because that almost, and I think as the empath, and I feel like you've been seeing that more and more, I feel like Maggie is kind of this place's kryptonite to a certain extent, because as someone who is, the empath of the group, who's able to kind of, like, I feel like more so than anyone, like, it is very befitting her being the empath, being the one that kind of ended up figuring out the glitch to this place. Luckily, they were able to save Mel, who was literally sinking into the floor. But they reunite, and it's like, okay, so we got to figure out the glitches and now kind of find our way out of here, because we got to trace back the memories. So Mel found that photo earlier in the episode. Like, who the hell is this dude? Focuses on it. Turns out the dude from the picture is a guy she hates. Once again, it confuses hate and love. So that's why his picture was there, like, oh, like, this is someone I admire. It's like, no, and love. It's like, no, this is a guy I hate, because the dean sent him there to sit in on her class, and she's like, wait, why, what? Dean's retaliating because, like, oh, you're not going to teach my book? Well, screw you. And trying to be like, oh, there was an oversight. I didn't let you know ahead of time. And so also, Mel, you're going to have to sign this NDA to kind of like, it's like, wait, what? That's also shady in its own right, too, that you're like, oh, you're trying to make it seem like this was an oversight, it was no big deal, and now it's like, oh, by the way, before you walk away, we need you to sign this NDA so that you won't talk about this. It's like, wait, what? How did that go from, you're trying to make it seem like it went from 0 to 60, it actually went to 60 to 100 in a moment. So that was interesting. But obviously, Mel got so agitated and pissed that she was like, oh, God. It's like a little place where everyone can kind of speak their mind, and she kind of calls out the dean in front of a whole bunch of students, and she's like, oh, can we play, please tell me there's a fast forward to it. It's like, nah, Mel, we have to watch this, because eventually this memory could lead us to understanding how we got here in the first place. And Mel has to watch it, and it's like, oh, this sucks. And obviously it trails them back to the memory, being an addict, basically ended up translating that those numbers that Harry translated from those symbols basically correspond with sounds, and so they put it all together, and they ended up chanting a spell. Didn't work, so they kind of gave up. But then, like, obviously we see the beginnings of like Mel and Macy's like back and forth, because it's like Macy calls Mel out for what she did. It's like, oh, like, you kind of got, I get it, like, there's a time you want to burn everything down, I get it. but was suggesting that sometimes you have to play the game whether you like it or not, because she's kind of in a similar situation with the whole safe space situation. It's like, well, the board kind of decides a lot of stuff, and it sucks. We have great plans, but I feel like I'm gonna have to let Swan down by telling her the truth and everything about, sadly this clinic idea isn't working out. But obviously it's the back and forth about like, no, my way of like, oh, like Macy kind of knowing to kind of keep herself a little tempered, while Mel is like, nah, like, because they even had that argument back and forth earlier, like, whoa, are you calling me hot-headed or something? That it's kind of like sometimes you need to kind of think before you act, and Mel kind of got caught up in a moment because it's like, no, like the dean was trying to silence me. It's like, yeah, but but now it's like you're potentially going to get fired because of it. So Maggie ended up kind of activating the spell by herself, and she tried to call them back in, but before she could, and to get snatched into the prison. So it's like they have to say the spell one at a time. So they do it again, and it's like, hey, we found our way out. Oh man, oh Macy, I'm so sorry. No, Mel, I'm sorry too. And it's like, yay! But then it's like, nope, we're still trapped in here because this picture isn't right. It's all three of us and Mom. The picture never existed. So the glitch still messing up. But I like what Maggie was saying. Like, regardless, it got one thing right. We are a family. So obviously getting in's the easy part. Getting out's not the easiest part. But it's like, right, we know that these, once again, the fog is an illusion. Kind of walk through it is kind of what Maggie was saying. Like, obviously what she was listening to, that mantra to kind of clear her mind and everything. So it's like, okay, so let's do this together. The charm wants to kind of break through. And so they all focus and they break the entire illusion, and we get to see the prison for what it really is. Scary ass place, interesting enough. There's a lot of, we see a lot of like structures, but we don't know how many cells are to each structure. So it's like, that's a lot of monsters. What's also interesting, and I think is kind of fascinating, but maybe this speaks volumes, is that they talked about that monster they run to. It's like, no, like Maggie's like, this is an illusion, because remember, we killed a real one and out there in the world, so there's no way it's here in the prison, which makes you almost think like, so that must mean that everything in there must be a one-of-a-kind thing. That's also another thing, too, I didn't even think about. CW Connection once. It's like, oh, yeah, it's kind of like Malivore. Not in the same regard, but it's like maybe it technically holds one of, like, there's only one of these ancient beings, and it holds one of them. So, never knew there could have easily been another one, but I guess it's like these things are so rare that, like, even if there were other versions of them, which probably aren't, there probably are one of a kind. So, luckily, they were able to just kind of get through. I thought it was suspicious that Harry was waiting for them, but it's like, oh, like our hypothesis kind of like, we kind of have an idea of where these rifts will open up, and this one ended up being in our backyard in Seattle. So luckily they were only going for 4 hours, but obviously because of the inside of that, it felt like forever, especially for Maggie, because she was in there for at least 42 days, at least for her, but obviously time is relative and everything. That is very maddening, and that could drive you to insanity, especially when you're losing your memories at the same time. So I just thought that was an interesting development, but obviously becomes a big question too of, well, at the end of the day, who made this prison and why? Like, once again, I brought it up before, there's also those towers, but I think those were more like an elder construction, like those towers. I don't know if it's been a while since season 1, so I don't remember if that was like something the elders made, or like was that something that already existed that the elders were just taking advantage of, because that was also the thing too, like it's like whoever made those tombs and prisons, pretty impressive. A security system, like a magical security system that constantly adapts like that. What I thought was interesting was like Mel was thinking like, well, it's a prison, and at one point she was saying guards, but it's like no one came, so it's like, oh, so this thing is purely automated because there's no guards there. Not unless they got killed by some of the monsters that managed to get out. But that's also the thing too. Tick Tick Boom happened like 42 times at least for Maggie. So at the bare minimum, there definitely more, but bare minimum, there's 43 monsters out there. That's not including the ones that already managed to get away got out before they got inside the prison. So, because each Tick Tick Boom was a monster escaping the prison, and that's why they just had to break the illusion so they can find the rift that some of the monsters were escaping. I wonder, is it just the prison itself that is each one kind of locked in their own cell, and are they bound by other means, or is it just you're stuck in this world? Like, are they all breaking out off their own? Like, are they kind of like some of them bound by like magical chains or something like that? It's what I'm curious. Or are they just kind of roaming the prison? Like, obviously you'd assume the cell doors keep them in, essentially. Obviously the prison in general, the main gates were opened up by the rifts, but I don't know if the individual jail cells were opened up. Because if they weren't, like, why would they only be going out like one at a time to in a certain sequence and pattern and stuff like that? So that in itself is kind of fascinating. But what I thought was pretty dope is, at the end of the day, though, each one of them, now they're back in the real world, kind of faces each one of their own problems. Obviously, Mel, she went super viral because her video ended up, like, the video someone had recorded of her, speaking her mind about the dean, got 700,000 views. She goes to work thinking she got fired, but Kevin's like, oh, you didn't know, she got the C word. I was like, C word? Canceled. I was like, oh, okay. That's why I was like, I was expecting you to say like the F word or like fired. And it was like, oh no, C. I was like, what C? What? Canceled. Okay, makes sense. That's kind of that's a very often used word nowadays. I use it a lot, mainly for the fact of, hey, the show I like got canceled, sadly. So, regardless, tangents and all that. And it's like, oh, because it's like, oh, we did what you told us, Mel. We protested on Twitter, Instagram, and they kind of put her on leave for kind of retaliating against you like that. So, and now Mel gets to keep her job. Maggie is able to kind of push her thoughts of Antonio away, and it's like, yeah, nah, this isn't about Antonio. This isn't about Jordan. It's just about, this is supposed to be the year of me. I'm not going to focus on another guy, and kind of clearing her minds about it. Like, yeah, like, even if this vision tries to come, I'm going to do my best to fight. I'm going to beat back this pink elephant. But then you also have Macy dealing with the safe space situation. And I love how she, like, maneuver that thing of like, oh yeah, you want to talk to the board about it? Cool. I kind of already made an announcement across social media, so if the board kind of pulls back on it, it's going to be a little bit of a whoa, like, the board doesn't like this idea of how things, this free clinic and everything, which the lady's kind of like, oh, you're an impressive woman. So it all worked out, in that case. And that's the thing, of everyone's together, like, hey, we were able, yeah, we're still unclear about, who made this prison and why, and how this translates to our allergies. But, which is interesting, that even though they didn't have access to their powers, because that also shows you, like, it has some power to, like, nullify, not, I guess, magic in general. So I think none of the creatures in there have, like, access to their powers or anything, you would assume. Or maybe each particular, like, binding of power is different. In their particular case, it's binding their magic, but maybe it apply. I mean, magic might manifest itself differently as different abilities for each creature. So maybe each one is kind of bound differently, not just necessarily magically. You can't do anything, but I don't know. It's, once again, I'm getting in too much in my own head, but it's like, I want to know and understand the intricacies of how the prison works and everything. But yeah, they still got a lot of questions. But at the end of the day, hey, let's celebrate our victories. And then at the very end, and you have Jordan busting in being like, hey, something big's out there with claws, and it's like, hear it roaring. So what that necessarily is, we'll have to wait and see whether that's something they immediately deal with off screen in between this episode and next episode, or whether that's something we deal with on the top of the episode. Once again, there's dozens of these things like running amok now. So it's definitely going to be interesting to see where all of this ends up taking us going forward into the next episode, especially because it's like, well, we know we're way in and out of the prison, and now I guess we're going to see them popping in more and more, and maybe that'll be our way to learn more about the prison, because I guess if they understand the prison a little bit more, maybe they can find a way to potentially closing the rift, because the spell Harry gave them, it's like, yeah, it's a Babylonian spell, but it's like, it's only like a band-aid for a wound, it's a temporary solution for now. So they got to find a permanent means of doing it. It took a great power like the source to kind of rip it open. So it seems like you probably need something of a similar vein to close like that dimensional rift. Probably not going to be the easiest thing, but we'll ultimately have to wait and see where things kind of go on that front. There's also still like the Abigail front. I'm like, what's up with her? Like after like her and Mel's talk last episode, like about, her literal demons trying to kill her, in the sense of her own demons trying to kill her in the form of her demon form, and what that looks like. Maybe we'll also kind of dive into a little bit more of her family circumstances, this sister that's trying to avoid her, have nothing to do with her. We'll see. Obviously, there's still the whole thing about Jordan's curse and everything, so still a lot of other moving parts, while also dealing with the allergy and the giant magical prison break. So it's going to be interesting to see, like I said, where all this ends up taking us. But really, that's all I'm going to talk about. So the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day, and goodbye.